Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chika. So I just realized before the break that I didn't actually put a whole lot of discussion about digital literacy in this presentation. That's actually my area of focus, and that's my training, is in the literacy department. So this presentation itself is, I mean, it's a little bit designing it's a new area of interest for me in terms of my research agenda here, but really building off of it from a digital literacy perspective. And I guess looking more at design principles around using technology with all students, and in particular with at-risk students or low progress learners, or here with normal technical students is my focus. So in general, I'll be looking at the way that using technology in classrooms can run the risk of digitizing the status quo. So this is a term that I've used in my own work. This tendency to preserve and reproduce ineffective pedagogy. So I'll draw a bit from my own ethnographic study that I ran in the U.S. As part of my dissertation, looking at a district with one-to-one laptop computing. Let me start the clock here. But in general, ways computers can be used to improve learning as supported by research, particularly within, as I mentioned, this long tail of PISA performance that's been a concern both here and here in Singapore. And also in terms of what learning science can say about issues of equity, which hasn't always been a big focus within learning sciences and CSCL. But I'm suggesting it may mean pulling away from the predominant ideas of innovation. So this idea of digitizing the status quo, that there is mounting evidence that technology around the world is exacerbating issues of inequality in society, but also in schools. So this is, I think, for any of us, this should be a big concern. It's also in many places part of an attack on teacher professionalism, this idea that you can somehow make education teacher-proof. And then in particular, so within, for example, computer-supported collaborative learning, which is kind of the computer focus area in learning sciences, there's a lot of discussion recently in the latest issue of the journal, in CSCL journal, talking about how there really hasn't been a focus on looking at innovations among low-performing students, and that's a future direction of CSCL. So we can think about technology. So Toyama looks at, for example, Toyama, for example, looks at the way that technology can be seen as operating according to the law of amplification, right? So technology is neither deterministic, it doesn't lead to specific effects in society, but nor is it completely neutral. It will tend to accelerate and amplify the effects that society already has, right? So what's already happening, technology will tend to amplify that. Also keeping in mind that there's really powerful discourses around technology that can make it kind of hard to have clear and focused discussion and planning and designing around it, because it's so closely tied to notions of progress. It's tied to really complex notions of what it means to be human, what it means to operate in our world. But it is also closely, So when we think about technology, we need to approach it with a critical perspective. So just to run through some of these kind of questionable assumptions that arise around technology. So one is that youth have inherent interest and capacity with digital technology, right? So this idea of the digital native, and granted there's some truth to it, right? The sense that the newer generations are excited about technology and capable with it, but really we can think about it more as a gradient, and we should also not, in the sense that there's older people like myself that love it and are savvy with it. And then there's a lot of young people who either don't really care for it or are not very savvy with it, right? So we need to be careful about homogenizing the ways that kids use technology. And the only way of knowing is by actually looking at the way that they're using it, talking to them about it. But also we need to design around heterogeneity. So there's also the assumption that these interests that exist outside of school will be automatically transferred within the school, so that students will be automatically somehow motivated by technology. And certainly, research will show that initially there's an effect that there's this novel effect of using technology in the classroom, but it tends to wear off fairly quickly. And again, so a lot of this is not particularly like groundbreaking, but I think the fact that there's still a lot of design that happens around technology that is counter to what we actually know. So there's this also an idea that there's an inherent capacity of technology to equalize the educational playing field. So a lot of this there's a Silicon Valley discourse that internet and we get computers into all these kids' hands and suddenly things are going to be equalized, right? It'll actually somehow raise people out of poverty and so on. So what we find is it's somewhat the opposite in terms of the broad effect that technology is having in the world and also in schools. So there's this technologist perspective that what technologies can do is more important than how they are actually used. And so going back to kind of the contextuality, Dragan's discussion about how the contextuality of actions, like that's really what's important here. So I won't discuss this in detail, but this is from my 8-month. So my dissertation was an 8-month ethnographic study in the U.S. in a southwestern city, looking at the way that one-to-one laptops were integrated by the teachers and the way they were taken up by the students in the classroom. So I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of that and kind of the methodology that I used, doing both kind of traditional offline ethnography, but using video a lot. And I took videos from students' computers. And so it was 8 months and quite dense data collection. So it was very close to look at the way that students use their computers, both online and offline. And I also interviewed the students and teachers and administrators about how the laptops were used and how they felt about it and so on. So this is kind of a look in the classroom at the kids using the computers, the laptops. So overview, just a quick overview. On the whole, the laptops were underused, they were poorly used. There was a lack of curricular support and poorly conceived plan for integrating. And so perhaps most importantly, the regimes of accountability structured the curriculum so heavily, in the sense that the teachers had so much pressure to prepare for standardized tests that the laptops either were ignored or they became ways to just prepare for standardized tests, which meant that the use of them was fairly, let's say, dumbed down. It was so simplified that for the most part they were not particularly useful. So I ended up, for the most part, most of my work so far is focused on the informal aspects of the things the kids did with it. So what I found is that they were doing quite complex things with their laptops. There was a lot of identity work that went on, a lot of kind of interesting literacy actions that they were taking part in. But there was also big variation. So a lot of the kids were doing very simplistic things, whereas some of them were doing more kind of complex stuff. Some of the more productive uses was really for very simple things. So for example, like composition, right? So just writing stories was something that was pretty well done on the laptops. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this is kind of, but when I'm talking about digitizing the status quo, this is the best teacher in the district in terms of her using the laptops. And this is her using it in as creative a way as possible to really just work on worksheets. So that it's the same old stuff, but taken to a digital format. And these are like, well, yeah. So, but most of the teachers really just used it for, mathplay.com, for example. Yeah. So in terms of what we know about games for learning, those kinds of games, not very effective. So I want to go back to that notion of motivation and engagement for students, and I'm just going to kill it. So simplistic motivation frameworks are definitely problematic, and especially when the burden is placed on students and their families. So that's something that was true in the US, certainly something that I see here a lot, right? So the idea that these kids are not motivated because kids that are falling behind, it's because they're not motivated, and that's because of a lack of family support, or that lack of motivation is inherent in them, or like it's within them, right? So I'll throw out kind of an older idea, but I think a very good idea of a better way to think about motivation. So this is an expectancy value theory of achievement and motivation. So it's quite simple, right? So the two major factors in motivation, the first is the expectation of success. So the fact that, nobody will be motivated to do something unless they actually expect to succeed, right? So you can also discuss that as confidence, right? So if kids don't have confidence because they don't see a pathway to success, then they will disengage from that. The second is relevance, right? So this is the value proposition of the curriculum, right? So we know that kids will do cognitively demanding things outside of school or within school, but outside of the classroom. They'll do extremely complicated things. So Ozzy researched, researched World of Warcraft. That's a great example. So kids play a lot of video games. Video games are extremely cognitively complex, difficult, lots of literacy, lots of math. I mean, World of Warcraft has lots of math, for example, right? So if you want to figure out what your attack damage is, you have to do pretty complex multiplications in your head fairly rapidly. Kids will do that because they see it as both relevant to them and they see a pathway to success through that. So, and I think what's good about this is that this framework doesn't place the burden on the students, but it puts it somewhere between the students and the curriculum, right? And the way that teachers engage with students. Okay, so because of this basing technology and the idea that it's inherently more motivating to students is risky. So you definitely should assume that it will just lead to more off-task behavior unless it makes students more confident and it makes the content more relevant to them. Okay, so taking another little step back and kind of talking about what we really do know about how effective technology is in the classroom. So there's a few of these little diagrams that I really like. This is from Hattie's 2008 Visible Learning book. That's kind of a meta-study of meta-studies, right? So it's looking at 800 studies of learning. And I think there's lots of critiques of it that are valid, but I think it's quite well done. And I like these little pictures because they give you a sense of, why use these different approaches. So in terms of computer-assisted instruction, there's so many studies that we have on them. There's quite a range of findings in terms of how effective they are. So this is the effect size. So D equals 0.37, that's the standard deviation. So this is, up to 1 standard deviation, and that's nothing. And so this is if you're going to critique him, you'll critique him for where he draws these lines. But if you look at the ranking, in terms of overall effects, computer-assisted instruction, not super effective in general. And that's drawing from, we're looking at almost 4 million students. And just by comparison, right? So, obviously we know that there's no silver bullets in education, but actually there are some that get kind of close, right? So there are some approaches that we know are super effective, and there are things that we know that are super ineffective. And unfortunately, if you look at many school systems, including the one here, it doesn't seem to follow that research, which is a little bit confusing for me. So these are some of the more effective ones. This in terms of curriculum, these are some of the top, right? Approaches to instruction. So feedback, super effective. Creativity, also super effective, right? And even within there, if you do it even kind of like the best ways, then you'll do even better than that. But when do we know computers are effective? We know that there's a large range in how effective they are depending on the approach, but keeping in mind also that when you're measuring, we know that when you're measuring something, you can't measure it objectively. You're always affecting the system that you're looking at. And of course, the elections, we know the polling and all that, like in the US, elections in the US, we know that the measurements are always it's quite complicated. But yeah, we know that computers are often not very effective, the large effect size, but generally not very high. We also know that to me this is interesting. The effect from computers is not increasing over time. So we can't say that improvements in technology are leading to more effective technology use in the classroom. We also can't say that as kids get more digitally savvy, that they are that it makes technology more effective in the classroom, right? Not a big difference across abilities and subjects, although it is there. So there's a lot of ways. This is taken mostly from Hattie, from his summary of different studies. So there's a lot of ways that we can use them effectively. I think we kind of know many of these: diversity of teaching strategies, train teachers to use them, and then multiple opportunities for learning. The last three I think are most crucial. When the student, not the teacher, is in control of the learning. When peer learning is optimized, when it's not individual, collaborative, and also when feedback is optimized. So also, I think this is even perhaps more important. The effect variable depends on how challenging the tasks were. So this is huge. So challenging tasks, quite a bit. I mean, still not super high, but high. Moderately challenging, it actually hurt their learning. Not challenging at all, it just destroyed their learning, right? It was like draining the knowledge out of their heads. That's a joke. So it's counterproductive to use it unless it's cognitively demanding. That means not emotion. So we need to parse what demanding means, right? There's tasks that are emotionally demanding because going back to the original idea of motivation I was discussing. They'll be emotionally demanding if there's no pathway to success, and if they're not relevant, right? So that will make it challenging in the wrong way. Also, learning should be clear and relevant. We know this. We know technology can catch the interest, but it takes good pedagogy, but also the contextual, let's talk about affordances, the contextual affordances of the technology itself, right? So using the technology for what it's really good for and what research will show us that it's good for. Yeah. So, and there's different ways to talk about those contextual affordances. Most of them, again, are actually the most effective models for contextual affordances are quite simple, right? So going back to kind of the basics of what we know. Philip and Garcia talk, I think, very effectively about text, tools, and talk. So even just the way that technology makes kids talk more around the tool about the content, that's going to do more than any of your fancy, let's say immersive games, which is the area that I've worked in for the 2 years before I came here. And sorry about this, I left this in there because it's actually the games and simulations from Hattie, also not very effective in terms of learning. So in the end, innovation might just mean collaborating effectively to make best practices that happen in technology first. So first you get best practices in there, and then you can think about doing something that seems novel, right? I know that may not work well for funding regimes, but I think it works well for our students. So going back to what works in the classroom, this is just one of my students, one of the students in the study, writing. So she wrote this by herself while she was actually playing a video game secretly in the classroom. And then she went and sat with the teacher, and the teacher helped her walk through it and edit real time, edit it, add on some of her ideas in the end. So actually a very good way for her to collaborate with the teacher in terms of getting immediate feedback and being able to put that feedback into practice right away, right? So if you compare this to paper and pencil, wouldn't have been able to do very effectively. So I guess I'm kind of just trying to make the point that it's a very simple innovation, but this was actually probably the most effective thing that I saw in the classroom that whole year. Also creativity programs, right? So, and kind of metacognitive thinking very effective. So in terms of the way that this thinking is influencing my own research agenda and how my research agenda is influencing that. So I'm working on a couple collaborations with Spectra Secondary School, which is a specialized school for normal technical students. So we're developing not an online platform, but an app, basically, to facilitate self-directed collaborative learning across subjects. So this is kind of a flipped classroom structure. The point is that it's giving more independence to students. It allows differentiation, but it also allows acceleration. And I'm putting, there's another, also taken from Hattie, another high effect size, letting kids who are ready for it go ahead. So things that you might do with more advanced students, definitely well positioned with normal technical students. So letting them go ahead when they're ready for it is a good thing. And also giving focus on mechanisms for effective feedback in that app. I'm also working on intervention aimed at making technology use more collaborative, creative, and more critical. But I should also say this also means trying to shift the discourse of the teachers, and I think that's why doing these kinds of partnerships for me is really interesting, because as we engage talking about it, they're talking about, they're talking about quite simplistic ideas of motivation, and so being there and talking to them and just kind of working through it in a way that's actually just shifts that discourse a bit, I think is maybe the most important thing that I would be doing there. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And like I said, I didn't actually talk about digital literacy really, but it's actually all about digital literacy. So if you want that to be explicit, I'm happy to talk more about it. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for this invitation to come here. It's a delight to be here. I must first debunk the impression that I'm speaking on behalf of an MOE official, because then you will direct all your disappointments, your angst, and whatever at the MOE official. So not quite necessarily the case. And I'm also trying to do something here. I'm trying to speak to you in the next 10 minutes without any PowerPoints. Now, I must say that today's session was very, very interesting to me, because in my previous life, I was working in the field of systemic functional linguistics and multimodal analysis. So really, my PhD was on systemic functional multimodal discourse analysis of classroom orchestration. So the work of Dragon, very interesting. I have a paper on spatial pedagogy, looking at how an MIT professor taught by using gestures in classroom space. So it was very interesting, and to hear the work that is being done in the area of subject literacy or disciplinary literacy, understanding the language of science. So I think these are areas that are very promising, and it's something that we can certainly do a lot more in. Now, what I'm trying to do here today is also to share with you some thoughts I have about learning sciences in relation to Roberto's very promising, interesting presentation, and at the same time share with you how one of the key contributions we see that learning sciences can bring is how it can inform the practice in the classroom. So we are looking at the aspect of research informed practice. Now, what does this really mean? Well, research informed practice means that it's not just folk informed practice, just because the practices has worked, the teachers share that these are practices that I've done before, I share with my teachers around, and in the other classes, and then I continue to use the same practices. I think research informed practice is a little bit more. We are looking at different ways of teaching. But the question is, why do we want to have different ways of teaching? Well, perhaps the current way that we are teaching is ineffective. Perhaps the different way of teaching that we are introducing is superior. Now, how do we know that? And what do we mean by ineffective? Well, one common criticism that we have had for the current way of teaching is that, well, we tend to teach the middle. And new ways of teaching allows us to devote attention to specific groups of students, low progress learners, like what Roberto's work is doing, or even allow us to deepen understanding and learning in different ways, looking at the specific profiles of students. So one promise or one contribution that learning sciences can bring to us is to show us why our current practices are ineffective, challenge our assumption, have understanding that tell us that, hey, this is the way that you've been doing, these are some of the assumptions that you have in the classroom, these are some of the way that folk-inspired practices have been done, and research is showing that this is ineffective, this doesn't work. And that's one key contribution that I think we'll find very meaningful and valuable. The second aspect of why we want to have different ways of teaching is that suggestion that the way that you're developing, the practice that you're developing is superior to our current way of doing it. And of course, the natural question is, why? Give us the reasons. The research, the evidence that you provide for this will convince policymakers as well as classroom teachers to take on the new way of teaching, the different way of teaching that you're proposing. So what are we looking at here? We are looking at value. Essentially, the value of the new way that you're proposing that we adopt in the classroom. So we have to ascertain value, and value can be ascertained through showing how the current ways are ineffective and showing how the new ways are superior. But there's also another aspect once value is ascertained, and that is the aspect of utility. And here I'm going to share with you two considerations that we have at the back of our mind when we think about practices that emerge from the various projects, understanding that emerge from the learning sciences. The first consideration for utility is shift in practice. If it works for one group of teachers with very close support by the researcher, the question is, do I require the same type of close support when I scale up or when I have more teachers take up? So if the practice requires a significant shift in practice, it requires a fair bit of capacity building of the teachers, then there will be one impediment to the utility, even though it might be very valuable. But this is not the end of the story, because you can, of course, build capacity. There are also ways to overcome this by providing available resources, adaptation support, and whatnot. But this must be a consideration. How do we bring a practice developed in a lab to the classroom? Well, the lab will show that it's far superior. But when you bring it to the classroom, we have to understand the current state of the teaching and learning in the classroom. So that's one consideration. And the second consideration is classroom orchestration. This is something that is almost, it's so simple, but sometimes we miss. Classroom orchestration refers to the state, and how, or rather it refers to how seamless the new innovation that you're introducing can be fitted into the classroom environment. So if your innovation requires them to go to the comm lab, well, that's a little bit more challenging, but it can be done. But your innovation requires the purchase of very expensive devices, a little bit more challenging, can be done, but a bit more daunting. So how seamless it is to fit into the ecology of the classroom? Must the teacher jump through hoops and hurdles before they adopt this particular innovation? Or can it be fairly seamlessly integrated into what the classroom is today? So shift in practice demands the researcher to have a certain understanding of where our teachers are, what are their current practices, and how do we scaffold and shift their practice to where we desire them to be. Classroom orchestration refers to understanding the classroom ecology, how teaching and learning is done in the classroom, the setup, the infrastructure, so that we do not introduce innovations that, or so that we are realistic about the innovations that we introduce in the classroom and the type of logistic that it demands. The current, a very favorite criticism of the use of technology is that it's too complicated, it requires too much time to set up, I am losing valuable classroom lesson time. And we can see that as pet peeves, but is there a logic behind it? Is there a reason behind it? One of the understanding that we have is that the barriers of adoption for educational technology is significantly lowered when the technology itself is reliable. When I want to use it, it works, it builds up my trust, and it's simple. So I don't have to jump through hoops and hurdles to use it. So what does this mean? Well, I think at the end of the day, we need to have value and utility. So what does this mean for us? Well, we still need to have upstream exploration, working in the labs with small groups of students, with a very niche group of teachers to experiment, to push the boundary, so that we are able to find some value in the practices that we are introducing, to show that our current practices are effective or to show that the new practices are superior. But at the same time, we also need to consider downstream application, the shift in practices required, and how do we scaffold that, and the classroom orchestration that's needed. And how do we find, instead of optimal technology, perhaps we just have to find the most available technology to approximate what we want to do, so that real change can be effected in the classroom. And I thought what Roberto mentioned just now was very insightful, that the innovation need not be sophisticated. Sometimes very simple innovation can bring about a huge difference in the classroom. And I think as I conclude, I think one key point that he made, and it's something that I think we all agree, even at MOE ETD, is that EdTech cannot save bad teaching. Can't be helped. If you're a bad teacher, I'm sorry. But one recognition we have is that EdTech can amplify great teaching. I'm paraphrasing, this is not original, I'm paraphrasing the PISA report. So EdTech, at the end of the day, amplifies great teaching. Why? Because EdTech enable new practices in the classroom, collaborative annotation, instantaneous feedback. It enhances current practices in terms of efficiency and whatnot. Right? So, in my current life, I'm a lead specialist with Education and Technology Division, trying to see how EdTech can improve teaching and learning in the classroom. And while we work with researchers, looking at upstream projects to find value, practices that bring about value, that can change teaching and learning, we are also very much concerned about the entire system, because we want the innovations that we have developed not just stay with the niche schools, not just stay with the niche teachers, but also benefit the rest of the teachers in the system. Right. So, any thoughts, questions?